Hey everyone, Anthony here. Podcasting. It's been a bit of a dream of mine for some time to have a go at starting a podcast, to learn the ropes, to have some interesting conversations with friends, and just to set out on a bit of a creative adventure to see where it leads me. And so, I'm making a start. Now, who better to talk to, I thought, than an old friend of mine who happens to be both a really funny guy and someone on an interesting creative journey of his own. So a couple of weeks ago, I sat down with Ed Smith for a cosy chat in my cottage. Our conversation ended up falling into two halves. Firstly, we talk about our creative journeys, finding points of contact, but also intriguing differences. Secondly, we talk about improv, our shared love of it, and all the richness it brings to life, both comedically, but also in terms of useful tools for everyday living. Now, in that section, we'll refer a lot to the local improv scene in Oxford. So if you're local and like the sound of what we're talking about, you'll find links in the description to all the groups that we mention. And we'd love to see you if you want to get involved. But whether that applies to you or not, thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you enjoy this discussion. Right, I'm going to do a clap so that I can synchronize the recording.
Smart.
That's how you do
simultaneous clap.
And we're off. So, Ed Smith, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to participate on my inaugural podcast adventure. It's nice to have a very dear friend here with me, and I wonder whether it might be worth just saying a few words about why we've decided to do this and how we know each other and sort of where we've come from.
Yes, let's do that.
Because I'm thinking back to conversations maybe 5 or 6 years ago when we were living together, and we joked about, it would be fun to do a podcast together. And I don't even know exactly what we had in mind when we were talking about that. Maybe it was sort of funny banter or jokes or comedy or something more serious. I don't know if you remember what was inspiring us or interesting us about that, but I certainly remember the idea floating around. And for me, almost kind of thinking, that would be fun, but no, realistically, it ain't going to happen. For some reason, I don't know.
Here we are. Yeah,
we are.
I don't actually remember talking about doing a podcast, but I remember sitting with Ben, my brother, and you as we lived together in a similar arrangement to this, just joking around. So maybe that was.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So, yeah, we lived together for some time, and in my mind, I have a lot of memories of...
In your mind?
In my mind, I have memories. I have a lot of memories of us being silly together.
Yeah.
And sort of banter and wordplay and silly jokes. And I think I want to sort of explore that a little bit as well, kind of the importance of silliness. Synchronized nod. But maybe we should start just by exploring a little bit more that question about podcasting and what the idea is here and what the attraction is. So I watched a video the other week by prominent YouTuber Ali Abdaal. Are you familiar with him?
Ali Abdaal.
Yes. Abdaal,
yes. They have a 1 degree connection or 2 degree.
Ah, really?
Yes.
Ah, interesting. And on this video, it's quite interesting because he was talking about how do you fill your time? How do you fill moments, small moments of time, without wasting them in today's world where often you just turn to scrolling on your phone or something?
Yeah.
And he had a few concrete suggestions, which were really cool. But one of them was actually record a podcast with your friends. using low-key equipment just on your phone or something. But there's something about a podcast which enables a kind of depth of conversation and a kind of like opening up and an honesty with people. So it's like we sort of want to have deep conversations, and they happen occasionally. It might be sort of in the pub or something, but there's something about actually sitting down and making the time for having a deep conversation that is actually a really kind of cool and healthy thing to do, and sort of like quite rewarding. Even if it's just a question of sitting down with your friends or family, and just kind of creating a space to have conversations that you'd kind of hope that you'd have anyway, but somehow you never quite find the time for.
I think that, well, that's a shared interest. We like deep conversations, and we both have a desire to create things, but struggle to create things, find the conditions for them. That was A. 2, or B, that I'm Ali Abdal. Yeah, so there's creating these conditions for deeper conversation, more interesting, let's say, than just small talk. That's a struggle for most people, generally. Maybe it is, don't know.
It's a struggle for me.
But we enjoy it much more when we talk about things that are more meaningful to us.
So it's this sense that there's something so rewarding about a conversation about something you both care about, that touches your life, that's sort of part of your life, and talking about that, exploring it together, sort of bringing it into the light. And it's about kind of this making a sort of space with someone you're already friends with and already know, where you can really go deep on something and explore it together. I find that hugely satisfying. Another thing I liked about this video was it was sort of throwing out the idea that you need to have like a really focused, clear point, or like almost a title for your podcast. It's like we have this way of thinking that like I have to have a really snazzy title. I have to know exactly what it's about. I have to have a lineup of people I'm going to talk to and know exactly what material I'm going to cover. And he just threw that out, and he was like, just frame it as a cool way of using your time, like as a good thing to be doing with a spare couple of hours, as a really rewarding thing to be doing to deepen existing friendships. So his emphasis is sort of like totally not on high production values and perfectionism. It's just on making a start. And I think that resonated with me right now. It's like, there's nothing to stop me having a go at this. It's not actually very hard to invite a friend over to my house. I mean, to be honest, the hardest thing so far has been setting up the equipment.
That didn't take that long.
I mean, yeah, it was a bit fiddly. We were trying to get 2 microphones to record at the same time and with the right balance. And I don't know if we've quite nailed it. Even so, even if we just use one microphone or just use the phone, it's not really the point in some sense. Like there's something more fundamental going on here, which is we're enabling ourselves to have a conversation.
Yeah, it's sort of sad, isn't it? Or we can look at it the other way, that we have to go, it's a good reason to meet up to do a podcast. It seems easier to do that than, should we just hang out? And I would have gone, I've got all these things I have to do today. Maybe it'd be better if we went for a drink in the evening so that I'd get all the things done during the day. Yeah. But it seems like recording a podcast is a good enough reason to spend a few hours late Saturday morning. It's almost like you need just a little invitation, a little kind of permission. It's like by formally saying, let's record a podcast. In your brain, you're like, oh, it's okay. I can allow myself just to go and talk to someone for 2 hours because it's a podcast. Yeah. It's like normally we don't allow ourselves just to have that freedom to say, let's just have a conversation. Yeah. I think there's also like pressure of justifying my time to my wife, who's busy working. Right. And the things I haven't done domestically during the week. I'm just going to go to Anthony's for a few hours while you finish packing up the term at school. But it's like, Anthony's we've been talking about this podcast and finally it happened. It's like, great, go and do it.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. So it's sort of like not just for ourselves, but in order for justifying almost the use of the space. It's like it gives us permission to take it seriously.
Yeah.
And we can see what comes of it.
Cool.
I've written down exploring ideas of importance in our lives. So I guess the question is, what ideas of importance in our lives do we want to explore? And I had this idea that we might want to talk a little bit about improv. But when I think of you, I think of the improv that you do, and I suppose the improv that you've been exploring and developing in recent times. But I also think a little bit about comedy and humour. I think, for example, of the stand-up routine I think you did maybe a bit over a year ago now. And it was really nice seeing that emerge as something that I'd heard you talk about. And as something almost like, I feel like living with you for those years was a little bit like an insight into some of your preparation for that. Because I'd see sort of like things that you found funny or approaches you had to humour. A lot of kind of, practicing imitations of accents in the kitchen, or a lot of sort of silly wordplay, inventing silly names.
Yeah, we like
silly names.
There's the game code names that we both enjoy. What's the premise of that?
It's about kind of connecting words.
Connecting words. So we like word connection. And one of the foundation improv is connections between things. If I say something comes to mind and you return it. So maybe that's a connecting thread from words and improv and stand-up.
So do you want to say anything about your own relationship with comedy, humour, how it sort of belongs in your life?
Comedy's fun. In my inner monologue, I think most of the time I'm trying to find something amusing to make people laugh. I think most of the time that's what's happening in my head. And that might be me, but it's other people as well.
Yeah.
That can be in a meeting, in conversation. Yeah, I'm just always looking for an opportunity to make people laugh. And that might not be the dynamic of the conversation, but that's what's going on in my head. I'm naturally shy, but I'm also a bit of a natural show-off, I think, both at once.
Those two things sound like they're sort of working against each other a little bit, or kind of pulling you in two directions.
They're probably quite good to be shy and a show-off, because if you're not shy and a show-off, you're annoying. And if you're shy and not a show-off, you'll never say anything.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. So comedy's fun. I like it in a monologue, is trying to make people laugh or myself laugh. And I don't know, always been like that. I guess it's a defense mechanism, isn't it, as well?
I was going to say that. I don't want to make things too deep and heavy.
You just said at the top of the show it was just going to be deep.
Yeah, it makes me think of, maybe it's a bit of a stereotype, I don't know, but you hear about comedians talking about how they got into comedy, why they sort of developed this tendency to make people laugh. And often it seems to be about dealing with dynamics in their life. Maybe as a child, it's like, I discovered that by making people laugh, I could stop people bullying me, or, there can be elements of sort of like, it's a way in which a person develops a sort of strategy for handling life, handling relations with others. It's kind of interesting. I don't think it's a strategy that particularly ever came naturally to me. So I don't think I sort of ever developed my key to dealing with life's difficult situations is to try and make people laugh.
But it definitely diffuses. It diffuses overly serious situations or overly intense situations.
Yeah.
I remember watching Have I Got News for You with my dad on a Friday night, probably from early teens. till leaving home. I really enjoyed watching these few and how quick they were. Like Paul Merton's quickness, and he's got an improv background as well. It's like, I just made myself appear with Paul Merton.
He also has a similar background to myself. Yes.
It's embarrassing to talk about my stand-up routine and comedy when like, the stand-up routine was 5 minutes long, and I've done one of them properly another 10 years before as well.
But
so anyway, yeah.
I mean, it was funny. And
good. That's good.
Was there in a sense of achievement around it? Because it was something that you'd worked up to, I think.
I think it's like this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I did a stand-up routine on orientation week in a Californian university I went on exchange to.
So we're talking
2008.
Right.
And my sister gave me a little notebook with all the comedians stuck to the front that she'd cut out, like Michael McIntyre and Billy Connolly and people like that. And I'd written down some funny ideas in that, and then decided, because I was in America and I didn't know anyone, I would do a stand-up routine in the talent show thing. And I almost didn't do it. And I used to think stand-up was you just got up and stood up and did comedy rather than writing anything and refining it. I thought you just stood up and improvised. That's what I used to think stand-ups were doing. But that's also because Billy Connolly, that's what Billy Connolly does. He used to play in his band in pubs, but he'd tell stories between songs and people found those hilarious. So after a while, it's like, I'll just do that.
His approach to stand-up really is improvisational and just...
I'll just tell a story and just pluck stories from his sort of memories. And
So he has some kind of innate or learnt talent for telling stories.
So that's one way of doing it, but
it's
presumably not the
norm.
Yeah, so most people write jokes, go and do stand-up, see what was funny, take notes. And the 5 minutes I had was at the James Street Tavern in Oxford, and they do this every Thursday night, and you can sign up for a slot. And if you're a newbie, you get put on at the end when everyone's been warmed up a bit. Which means it's really nerve-wracking for 40 minutes.
So, how was the 2008 experience?
Oh, yes.
I mean, did you prepare? Or did you just... Yeah, you did.
I did prepare, but I prepared a lot. And they didn't give me a specific slot. I was so nervous, but did it anyway. It did help that Americans are very generous with their laughter, and they're like, oh, funny British guy. So it was all fine, and it was low stakes. And I did some of the things I'd thought of. I'd written out jokes and then just ad-libbed a bit. And then really sort of, after the sort of first few minutes of getting into it, I was really enjoying myself and did some ad-lib stuff. And people seemed to be responding well. And then after what felt like 5 minutes, one of the lecturers organising things started walking down the aisle. And I was like, okay, I've got to go. I think my time's up. Thanks. Good night.
Was that genuinely?
That was 18 minutes later.
Oh my goodness.
So,
wow.
Show off. So I am so glad I did that. And then I did another stand-up routine at the Catholic Student Union in Edinburgh, where I used to hang out a lot as a talent show, and it absolutely bombed. And I was really nervous. It was a very small room with loads of my friends. And I think because I was so nervous, that didn't help.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that funny either.
So that sounds quite disappointing.
So that was disappointing.
As a follow-up.
And then 10 years plus passed. I really wanted to, so I did improv I did one improv session at Edinburgh at the Edinburgh student improviser. They have a show on a Friday and then a workshop on a Saturday. I went to the Saturday workshop once, and it took me ages to pluck up the courage to do that. And that was really fun, but they throw us into the deep end. And I remember doing a 3-act musical, like from scratch, never done any improv before. And like we did a few things over an hour, and then we went to a 3-act musical. Like a massive ask. Someone comes onto stage and sings about their woes to a barman, and then someone else comes in with some kind of solution to the problem, or the potential solution to the problem, and then a third person comes in and is the solution to the problem. But we're all singing, and they said, sing it to the tune of Can You Feel the Love Tonight? Or something like that.
Wow.
And I was the third person. And we hadn't pre-agreed who the third person would be, or which order people would come in. But so I was too nervous. The first two had come in, and I think they'd done it before. And so I had to sort of round out this scene. And I came up with something. I don't know where it came from. And it was funny. And there's a real buzz from it. So that was hard, but a real buzz and exciting. And then it took 7 years to have another go at improv. So
I mean, talk about being thrown in the deep end.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty terrifying.
It was, but it's still low stakes. It's that
Was it-
thing with about 3 people watching.
Was it a show, or was it just a sort of workshop type?
It's a workshop.
Yeah.
So low stakes, but
Mm.
for someone, if you're not really acted before, I never did any acting at school. Did you do acting at school?
No, not to speak of, except I had a very drama-friendly primary school teacher. So there were like 2 years at the end of primary school where we were doing a lot of sort of musicals and small plays and things just as part of our sort of like school curriculum. But then throughout secondary school, I never did anything. But it's a regret for me. It's like, it's as if I wasn't able to really develop that interest. And I don't know if I really knew that I had it. It sort of almost went dormant a little bit. I relate to your shyness. So there was a sort of aversion to putting myself in situations or environment where I might feel judged or threatened or overly kind of observed. There was sort of like something going on for me as a teenager, which was like hiding in some sense, wanting to be invisible.
Probably quite common for teenagers. Or some teenagers.
And I think even, throughout university, I was still perhaps not confident enough to be exploring more theatrical things. So that sort of interest kind of emerged later for me. And I wish in many ways I'd kind of been able to explore it sooner, actually. So yeah, I can relate, I think, to this sort of gradual attraction, but also finding it a bit scary and a bit difficult.
So we were in a play together that you wrote.
Mm.
And before that, I remember when it first came to Oxford, you had just finished a video.
Yes.
About British saints.
Yeah.
And that was quite a masterpiece. I think you spent a lot of time on it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I'd be happy for it to be called a masterpiece, but it certainly absorbed a lot of my time and effort and was like immensely rewarding. In fact, I don't know if I've ever been quite as immersed in a project as I was in that. It was meant to be completing my master's at the time.
Yeah.
It's sort of almost like I just parked that for 2 months and then came back to it. So I think it taught me a lot about myself and my love for immersing myself in creative projects. I love creating things and feeling like I'm sort of exploring something and trying something and putting something together.
You said you did nothing in your last sort of performances were end of primary school.
Yeah.
And then nothing that you had regrets in senior school.
Yeah.
That's the first thing that I know of you have done, having done the Saints video and then those 2 plays that we did together. But did you do anything before that, and why did you do the play?
Yeah. I view it for myself as almost like a process of creative rehabilitation through whatever opportunities I kind of found. So I think really the starting point was I got involved through some friends with sort of writing bits of material for exhibitions about various people. There was one on John Henry Newman. And in one of those groups, we decided to try and make a little sort of video, which involved us dressing up and acting a scene from a little known novel by Newman called Callista.
Mm.
And I was meant to be playing this Roman soldier who was madly in love with Callista and was like coming to propose. And I remember, filming for this and giving this rather wooden kind of performance. But through those sorts of things, I just started to have the opportunity to kind of get involved in these little creative projects. And at the time when I was doing the video you're talking about, I sort of volunteered to lead a team producing that exhibition. So for me, that was sort of an opportunity to have more of a kind of creative oversight or vision.
Mm.
So the project or the brief was create something about saints connected with the theme of the unexpected. With the help of friends, I researched saints who seemed to be a little bit unknown or unexpected, or have like aspects of their life which were a bit weird, and sort of tell their story a bit. And I decided the most effective way to do that was to write a little script.
Mm.
So it's a bit like devising a play, kind of, but with elements of real life stories and even borrowing things that they'd written, sort of assembling material. And, elements of collaboration, like there was a friend of mine who suggested a lot of bits of music that kind of worked well with what I was trying to do. So, yeah, this sort of, I guess, experience of making something, but with the collaboration of others, which I just always find immensely rewarding. You remember when the Lord of the Rings films came out?
Yeah. 1999, 2000.
Around then, yeah,
Something
early
like that.
2000s. So, I remember watching the extended version of those, and on the DVDs they had all of this like extra bonus material.
Yeah.
And they had these documentaries about the creative process of making the Lord of the Rings. And I just remember thinking, wow, that just looks like the most cool thing ever, to be part of this massive, almost like creative family, just devoted towards making something. So I think I kind of fell in love with that sort of grand project. And in a sense, there's always been this desire I have to be sort of part of these kind of creative projects, part of sort of making something together. So I think maybe my kind of experiments and projects have all been sort of ways in which I want to tap into that interest I have. And I think the play that we did together was another example of that. I never really did any drama or theatre at school, but I kind of feel like I'd like to try it. I don't feel courageous enough just to rock up to some local theatre group and ask them if I can do something. It almost felt easier to me just to sort of like involve some of my friends and do it together in a sort of safe environment. So, I think that a lot of that has to do with my own sort of particular journey I've been on. And if anything, now I'd be a little bit, not critical, but I'd sort of realize that maybe I was trying to kind of keep things in quite a controlled sort of space that was sort of like what felt comfortable and familiar to me. It's like, oh, with this group of friends, maybe I can have a go at doing a play, But I'd still be a little bit sort of like, it's just an amateur thing. I don't want to sort of like put myself out there and go and talk to the professionals. I don't want to be sort of like too overwhelmed by feeling I'm not good enough. So I think for me, it's been sort of like a process of finding places and ways in which I can sort of reconnect with the creative side to myself. And that's an ongoing project.
Yeah.
Which is sort of picking up steam, I think. It's sort of, this is another aspect of it. It's like, I get excited by ways in which I can be sort of developing myself creatively and exploring things. And for me, there's an aspect of like personal development in there. It's like I want to overcome the areas of myself where I feel a bit afraid of putting myself out there, afraid of judgment, afraid of not being understood properly. So gradually, at my own sort of fairly cautious pace, I try and sort of like try things.
I find it really interesting that the surprise play with our friends, that you considered the friend group as the safe space. For me, I consider completely strangers. That's the safer space.
That's
they don't
interesting.
know me very well, so I can break free of any modus operandis and ways of being that you develop with people that are really hard to change. I find that easier.
That's an intriguing difference in approach, isn't it? I must say that your take holds quite a lot of attraction for me. It's like I'm starting to see that maybe there's a lot for me to gain from sort of letting go of my own standards and my perfectionism and sort of like putting myself out there in let go.
Let's go.
Something that's emerging in both our stories and both our experiences is there's an element of like gradual development of the self, confronting things about yourself. There's a connection with self-awareness and self-development, something almost a bit therapeutic. So for me, it's like by exploring creatively, I get in touch with a part of myself, I recover a part of myself, I become more authentically myself. And I feel like in the last year or so, as I've sort of had a go with improv, started to become familiar with some of the principles of improv, that started to massively play into that process of exploration. You know, it seems to me it's not about necessarily just becoming a really, really skilled, funny, spontaneous performer who can entertain loads of people. It's almost like improv provides something which is really valuable as a means to learning stuff about yourself, a means to kind of growing somehow.
So I started doing Imran Mirza's improv
In Oxford, on Wednesdays.
On a Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Which is, he does an amazing job of making anyone feel welcome and remembering your name every time you go. That's a drop-in thing. You can go every Wednesday, or Wednesdays are 1 in 5, go away for a year and come back. And we play improv games and sort of Imran comes up with different things we do each week, and it's very performative from the beginning. Some people are audience and some people are acting. And we always start with Ninja to warm up the game.
Yeah.
So I did that for a little while. It took me a couple of years to pluck up the courage to go. And then I was desperate for friends to come. I remember asking friends to come and no one came. Which I think was good for me. Well, anyway, that was fun. Paul Z. Jackson came a year ago, who is a long history of teaching improv, and then taught it more systematically. And then a group of 6 of us started to perform the Awkward Actors, which is the name of Imran's group. And then the 6 of us started to perform every 2 weeks on a Sunday night in a pub, which was scary. And Paul took us through a 6-week or 8-week course to learn the basics of improv, which now we're doing, called Improv in 6 Acts. And we're
as an ongoing course that people can do. Yeah.
And you did one very recently.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember having conversations while that was going on where you had to confront things about yourself that emerged from the session.
Right. Big time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we can definitely dive into.
Sorry, didn't we?
No,
You have to talk about it.
It's very interesting. I mean,
it's very personal.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how like quite personal things come to the surface, I find, in through these sorts of conversations. I mean, I think that's sort of what you're suggesting, right? For me, some of the things I found difficult about improv made me aware of like kind of patterns or difficulties I have more generally in life, and there's sort of a connection there. So for example, status is quite a big thing in improv. Sort of like, you can think on the surface that what you're doing is about inventing loads of weird and wonderful stuff. Like, I need to come up with a really inventive suggestion for a profession or a place. But actually, I've sort of started to realize that often you can come up with very, very boring, everyday things. And what makes a sort of improv scene quite interesting is the dynamics that you're exploring in terms of the relationships between the characters. Well, one of the ways you can think about that is status, right? So you can be given some random scene and you've just been told, who you are and where you are. And it's overwhelming. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm on the beach. There's a 3-headed sea monster and I've got to decide whether I want to slay it or run. It's like a lot to take in. But if you sort of instead just try and inhabit a kind of status, it's like, I'm terrified, or I'm completely in control here and I'm going to boss everyone around, then it gives you this sort of like trick where you can kind of overlook all the details of this confusing scene and just sort of know how to inhabit that space and how you're going to behave in relation to other people. So that's quite cool and quite powerful. But what I've noticed is, for me at least, it really exposes like what comes naturally to me and what doesn't.
Yeah.
So, and also you sort of notice that more perhaps in relation specifically to other people. So, I've noticed that with some people, I find I fall quite naturally into a way of relating with them. Like there's a guy who, on my improv from 6 acts course, it's like whenever we work together, we just sort of like become very silly. It was all very kind of like, really, really fun. But others, it would be like, it's like they're sort of assuming a higher status position and I'm kind of assuming a lower one. And, Or, you've noticed these sort of things. And for me, it would kind of shed a light on what comes naturally to me and what doesn't. It can be really valuable because it can help you to stretch outside of what's comfortable. And that's just hugely beneficial for life. It's like, if I know how to sort of place myself in a slightly higher status kind of, role, even when I don't feel very comfortable with that, or I'm having to deal with parts of myself that feel kind of not at ease with that, that's something I can work on, and that can actually help me to face situations in a different way, and perhaps a way that's better for me. So I think that would be an example of how I started to see connections with sort of like therapy, ongoing self-development. And I found that improv was sort of a useful tool for both like shedding light on those things, but also working on them and like finding different ways of inhabiting situations, I think. Practicing, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the wonderful thing about improv. It's therapeutic. It helps you develop things that are undeveloped. If you're too shy, it helps you be more confident.
I mean, presumably the inverse as well. If you're always sort of almost dominating situations, then it could be useful to sort of experience lowering your status.
Yeah, lowering. Yeah, and status at different points. It's a really weird construct when you're at work. You adopt the status that you have with your job hierarchy, and most organizations are hierarchical. So you would adopt a lower status to your boss. Why? Just because they're your boss. That's because we've said that's how it's going to work. But outside of work, your status is suddenly different. You go to the pub with your colleagues, the status completely shifts.
Yeah.
And at lunchtime, this shift, and then you can go to a meeting and suddenly you change status again. So we're constantly playing these games, which Keith Johnson talks about in his book. He's an
improv guru, sort of founding father, almost.
One of the fathers of improv. Yes, and one of the principles that Paul Z. Jackson talks about in his way of teaching improv is short turn taking, which that's one of the things I find quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because, again, it sort of ties ties to status, but in conversation, you maybe the higher status person will talk more at length.
Mm-hmm.
And then the lower status or person adopting a lower status will talk less. In conversations that are going well, there's more of a 50-50 split between how much contribution someone's making. Like you're another Paul Z. Jackson thing, co-creating. And improv seemed to go well. I'll give you just a small thing, and you take the small thing and you add another small thing, and I take those two things and add another small thing. That's how it works when it's working well. But I always think about that in terms of conversation.
Yeah.
You're trying to go between two extremes. You can talk too much, or you can talk too little. And sometimes it's appropriate to talk too much or too little, depending on what you're doing.
Right.
But it's more fun when you're both talking or contributing. It doesn't mean you have to talk a lot, but both contributing.
It's reminding me of one of the early experiences I had with improv, which I guess might be common, which is this sort of like experience repeatedly of having to sacrifice your own plan or idea. You're like, oh, I need a good idea. Oh, yes, this is where this scene can go. And it's like you try and maybe like change it in that direction, but your little offer gets either ignored or just taken in a totally different direction. It's like, no, that's not what I meant at all. But this sort of change in mentality that's needed, which is sort of like getting over the disappointment or the attachment to like your own ideas in pursuit of something different, but maybe something more satisfying, which is we're going to somehow let something emerge co-created, and we're all contributing just little offers, sort of incrementally building something. And it means that no one has total control over where it's going or what it's becoming. It's very much gathering little contributions from all of us, and the end result is like strangely bigger than all of us.
And better. It could be a mess.
It could be a mess.
It's a bit weird that it actually does emerge as better most of the time. It could be a complete mess.
Maybe one of the most extreme examples I can think of is I remember like Keith Johnson talking about a task where you tell a story in a whole group, and the whole group in a circle has to say the same word. You're sort of looking around. It's like, how are we going to decide what the next word of the story is? But somehow it's possible to actually make that work, through maybe it's just a question of, enough people say the same word and it drowns out those who say something different. But it's possible for a group to tell a story as one single unit, one word at a time. It's like a bit mind-boggling, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
I don't know if you've actually tried that.
We tried that in one of the preparation classes for the performance. I think we're having a conversation in pairs as if we were one person each. Yeah. But instead of taking turns saying the word, we said at the same time. So it's like, hi. And I'll be with someone and you're with someone. Yeah. And you guys respond with, how are your parents? Yeah. And there's always sort of micro leading and lagging between the pair, one person and the other. We've both done this at the beginning of the improv in 6 acts as you're learning improv. Like we might be doing the word association game. Cheese. Fondue. French. Horn. See, I've overthought something. I couldn't think of anything quickly. So my brain, this is a good example. You're trying to find the next funniest or best thing, best word that can come next, rather than just cow or I was going to say horn again. That would be rubbish.
But even like if we said horn again, it might be horn, or another horn, a rubber horn, or there's sort of like there's that sort of censoring we're doing, isn't there? Which is like kind of throw out, not funny enough, not good enough, not original enough, maybe too rude, too embarrassing, too controversial.
Betray my thoughts. That struck me when I read Keith Johnson's book. I think it was called
Improv.
Yeah. that was what shocked me, because I hadn't really done any improv at this point when I read the book, except the one in Edinburgh. Where he's like, you need to unlearn censoring yourself.
Yeah.
That seemed the scariest thing. What? Especially when you're performing as well. What happens if I say something that is just horrendous?
Yeah. Yeah.
People will think X about me.
That sort of makes me think of another really nice thing about improv, which is assuming we're managing that. So we're kind of putting our censor to one side and just allowing ourselves to really be spontaneous. It actually creates a very forgiving environment, because you have this agreement that you're not really going to judge anyone if something inappropriate or crazy comes out of their head. Because, like, let's face it, I mean, like, that's sort of where all of our minds go sometimes. So if you sort of like accept that, and, you know, something comes out and it's a bit rude or inappropriate, you just sort of like accept it and chuck it away.
Yeah.
And there's no judgment associated with that. I think it actually maybe is part of what contributes to this feeling of authenticity and freedom. I made friends quickly in that 6-act group, because it's like you're having to be really sincere and sort of just like yourself. And there's an environment where that's okay. And it's like you're sort of really like receiving everybody as they are. That's also another thing I think that has been tremendously kind of cool about improv, actually. Just like everybody's there as they are, and there's no problem with that. You know?
No, it's really cool, because that's the only thing in common between us, is that we want to be there doing improv. Yes, and is the common, improv principle.
And yes, sorry,
and yet. Paul calls it accept and build.
Accept and build, yeah. So it's like everything is an offer, and whatever offer you receive, you accept it, and then you build on it. You try and add something.
So the whole mindset of improv isn't judgmental. It's not just the offer, but how they've offered it, what accent they've used, what character, everything is saying yes, in the sense that, well, that's what you've offered. You can't say no, sorry, let's start again. Because that's how it was. It is. It's cool.
The or the build is about sort of not blocking what you've received, but sort of embracing it and incorporating it and taking it a step further. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you even necessarily like what the other person's created. You might even not like it. But that can also be quite funny in a scene.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember Keith Johnson gives these examples where the blocking, the sort of no's, again, come from our censor. So it's like there's a scene like someone's trousers are on fire. Someone's like, oh, we'll have to take them off. And like, the person's like, no, sort of like, again, it's sort of like, oh, we don't want to go there, so it, rather than sort of, okay, we'll go with that, this is sort of like we're putting up barriers because we may be being taken somewhere where suddenly there's a little part of us which is fearful, or
I think that's fine as well. I don't want to do scenes that I think are debaucherous or excessively rude.
So is there a way in which there's an offer which doesn't fit with your taste? So is there a way in which you're accepting that?
This is an interesting,
but you're not sort of like at the same time you're not blocking.
Yes,
I think that's interesting. Isn't it?
I think my sensibilities and thought on this can often be much more restrictive than others. So you have to find ways that you take it somewhere else. And a common thing in the shows, people write suggestions on cards like this of professions. Scenes they'd like to see, or locations. So this one's personality disorder, got zombie apocalypse. So you're censoring that. I was going to not read it, but there's nothing wrong. I just don't recognise my own handwriting.
What did you write? I'm curious.
Blackadder goes forth to the future. I censored that because I thought it was lame. There you go. Call the postmaster. What I was trying to find was, so often you get brothel or something sex or something. Just people want to see what you're going to do with it.
Yeah.
And some of them you see them so often that we get skilled at, we call it honouring the suggestion. People want to see you incorporate the suggestion, but you can do it in a creative way that doesn't take you beyond the limits of what you want to do.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of whilst we're saying yes and, we can still say yes and we'll go this way rather than no to your idea completely. What I enjoy about improv is you have to be completely in the moment, so you forget things. Your everyday life, your worries, that as an adult are always in your head. So it's more childlike. It feels like play, and it's a reliable way of entering a flow state that you don't really find in many other places, maybe sport. And I always find when I play tennis or squash, I can still, if I'm playing with friends where it's not high stakes or we're not really playing competitively, my mind still wanders to things. And it's only in a really intense
high stakes situation
I really get into the moment. But it's the same with improv's more reliable at getting into the moment. In the improv in 6 acts, we start at 7 in the evening. Just had a full day of work, and the first 5-10 minutes we get into the room and we look around and try to get into the moment. And I find that quite hard, actually. It's only when we start playing the game that I get into the moment, the first exercise, because it requires you to focus properly. If you're walking around a room, like, why didn't I say that earlier in the day and need to do that later? You're just thinking about things.
It's making me think of a lot of the exercises and games are sort of about attention and like opening up your attention to what's really there in the moment in the room with you. So sort of like being more attuned to what's going on, like the simultaneous clap game, but lots of other ones. You're trying to have this sort of heightened sense of presence where you're kind of like letting go of like whatever's going on in your head to some extent, I think, and just sort of being there, best able to kind of just respond and react.
It only works if you do that.
Yeah.
Because I remember in one show, something we were doing made me think of something else. And I was performing in a scene with one other person or 2 other people.
Yeah.
And my brain suddenly got hijacked from being in the flow in the moment to whatever it was. And then the other person said something.
So you lost.
I'm in front of an audience in a scene, and I have no idea what we just were doing.
Yeah.
So you have to then say something.
Yeah.
So it only works if you're paying attention all the time.
That presents different challenges for different people. I mean, I feel like I'm the kind of person who, my mind's always like getting distracted. And what's that? I tend to have a lot going on in my mind. The kind of person who tends to overthink things. And I noticed that's a bit of a struggle for me. Like, sort of, I really relate to what you were just describing, which is I'm meant to be present in this moment, but suddenly, like, I get totally distracted and my mind starts, like, thinking about something and it's taking me away from where I am. That affects sort of many spheres of my life, right? I notice that at work a lot. It's like I'm in a meeting, I'm meant to be like listening to a colleague, I'm meant to be thinking about a difficult problem, but I just suddenly realize I'm thinking about like lunch or what what I was doing this morning. And it's like
all this podcast,
and it's like, actually, I don't really have a clue what that person just said. And I just have to sort of wing it a bit. So, I mean, I guess most people have these sorts of experiences, but it seems to me like that's another area where improv might be helpful in sort of developing an ability to be a bit more present or to have a bit more control about that, perhaps, sort of to notice it more.
Yeah.
And to be like, okay, what are the ways in which I can guard against that and try and be present in this situation because I want to be listening to what's going on. I want to be seeing everything around me so I can be contributing in the best way possible.
What's great about improv for me, and perhaps you as overthinkers, what I despise a lot about myself is overthinking and not taking action. I think that's a strong word, but I used it. So, for example, this morning, I had an hour and a half to play with, really, before I cycled over here. It's like, what should I do? There are so many things that I need to do. I was also really tired. Well, maybe the best thing is to just relax. How do I relax? I don't want to scroll or watch videos endlessly, which I did end up doing. But I read a book to begin with, Cal Newport's book about email. But even choosing which
What's
book
it called?
to read.
Deep Email.
A World Without
Email.
Which is a wonderful book we should talk about. That I even overthought which book to read. It's like, oh, that's too businessy. You need to read something more creative.
Yeah.
And I decided that that's what I wanted to read, so I was going to read it, which was a good decision. So there's a bit of overthinking going on. So I like that. That's what I'm trying to practice in my life all the time, is to stop thinking about what I could do and do something.
Mm-hmm.
And improv's amazing for that, because with the word example, you have this sort of catalogue of words that spring up in your mind when it's your turn to add a word. You can't endlessly think about which one it is, because you've got about probably maximum of 1 second, which is a long time actually to choose one. So you have to do something.
Sure.
So I always appreciate it when people give an offer, rather than when shall I come round? I'll come round at 7, if that's okay, and then you can respond. Paul talks about having a strong offer, and I think Keith Johnson maybe describes it as wimping out as a common bad habit of improvisers learning. So if you don't commit to something, you end up with a really boring scene.
Yeah,
for example,
well, it sort of fizzles out.
Or your character, you don't know what your character, like you're building a scene, you're trying to build a relationship between the people. So you can come in and say, weather's nice today. And the other person says,
yeah, bit rainy.
Maybe I should put this umbrella up. The scene's going nowhere.
Yeah.
You haven't established who you are to each other. And you can keep going like that. But it's wimping.
Yeah.
You haven't committed to anything. So you could come on stronger and say, Tony, you stole my umbrella again. Already, we've got a character, Tony, not just a name, but this guy steals umbrellas. Why is he stealing umbrellas? It's a strong offer. And then you've got something you can do with it because you know you're Tony and you stole my umbrella.
I'm quite comfortable being Tony.
It's your name after all.
I did steal your umbrella, Patrick. And you'll never guess where I've put it.
You didn't put it down the toilet, did you? No, that's really bad response because it's a question.
Yeah, so I mean that's something that I found really interesting. Like, I remember often in the 6 Acts course being in situations where my offer came to mind as a question. And I think it might be for me that I don't like to impose myself too much. So I actually often phrase things as a question. It's like, sort of, what would you like? Oh, are you sure? Would you like to, so it's like, it was almost like just naturally the first thing that was coming to mind was some sort of inoffensive question.
Yes.
Would you like to perhaps sort of like, so it's hard for me, but it's actually, again, been really fruitful to sort of notice that as a pattern. And this strong offer thing is like, again, it applies more generally. It's like, oh, maybe like in life, I can make stronger offers. Like, let's do this. Or, Paul often says, you know something. Yes. What do you know? Yes. So it's like that sort of like, what do I know? Is quite an empowering way of facing all sorts of situations. In fact, like I know something, I'm contributing something, I'm offering something here. Don't know, it's still for me like something I'm exploring, but I feel like it's a useful thing more generally, you know. To make strong offers is something generally useful in all sorts of exchanges or
I think it's really
relationships, you know.
If in work,
Yeah.
if someone says, "Oh, guys, do you think we should we take course of action X?"
Mm.
And then you put all the burden back on them. They've got to make the decision, or come up with some way of evaluating whether we should or not. Instead, you can say, "My recommendation is we buy this printer, this Brother 2300, for $9.99 with a subscription on the ink, because over 1 year it's going to cost us less than actually if we buy the cheaper one with a one-off ink cartridge that runs out." And then you've given your reason, you've given your recommendation, and people can react to that and question it. But it's much easier to do that than, should we go for A or B? And then they have to think of a way to evaluate your proposal. We haven't really proposed anything.
Well, I'm glad I made the strong offer of inviting you
Exactly.
for this podcast.
Exactly.
It was quite concrete. So I was like,
Very concrete.
let's do it on this date at this time.
Yeah.
And yeah, it feels like it's enabled us to just make a start, you know, do something and have an interesting conversation.
Do something, say something.
I mean, in a way, we've been talking about, I've written down a tool set for life.
Yeah.
We're talking about specific examples, I guess, of improv related skills and tools which have this carryover. So, you know, on the one hand, we might be aiming at performing in a show and making people laugh and saying something funny. But on the other hand, we're sort of like developing skills which are really transferable and are helpful in many other spheres of life. It's a bit of an endless mine of treasures, the world of improv, I think. Perhaps that's the point at which we want to leave things.
I suggest it is. That's my strong offer.
I accept your strong offer. Edward Smith, thank you very much for this conversation. I've enjoyed it. I found it thought-provoking, stimulating, dynamic, encouraging. It's given me lots of ideas of things I want to talk to you about in more detail, and perhaps we can explore in the future.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
It's good for synchronizing the end.
Mm-hmm.